Welcome to Bigfoot Odyssey story time. Got two more great stories here for you today. This first story comes to us from a couple. It's an elderly couple from Florida. Hope you enjoy. Some years back, as we ventured into retirement years, our 5 sons decided to give us a hobby that would get us out of the house on weekends and into the sunshine. They bought their mother and I a pair of Bounty Hunter Time Ranger metal detectors. We started out metal detecting local parks and graduated more recently to old trails. There are trail maps available online. We were told by a gentleman in Happy Camp one weekend about an old stage line that ran through parts of the forest that was still visible in certain places. We were not certain what might be found on such trails, but we struck out anyway with intense curiosity. The first day out, we found a rusted horseshoe and a gold pocket watch that, after it was cleaned up, bore an inscription that read, "My beloved husband, 1811. Quite a find for old treasure hunters like us. The excitement spurred us on through most of the second day and long hours of finding nothing until my wife's arm was shaking. That day we found a gold band, a very old rusted horseshoe, a spoon and metal parts that was probably used on the wheel rims of a stagecoach. Nobody seems to know what those metal pieces were. Soon, the end of the day was approaching, and we were losing daylight. Still, we needed to walk miles back to the camper before dark. We started back to the RV at a snail's crawl, working the opposite side of the old stagecoach line. My wife's arm was hurting. I was working both hers and mine, swinging both metal detectors down and over old wagon wheel ruts in the road. I fell behind Mary some yards, my head down, working the MDs. Then it happened. I heard Mary calling out my name. Finally, I stopped, looked up and on down the road ahead of me to see what she wanted, and there she stood, pointing into the trees at this thing that was just standing there. My first instinct was bear. Then instantly I was puzzled. It was standing upright, looking directly at Mary, the two of them not 40 feet apart. I was shocked and taken back. It was quite large, well built and male. Not tall as to be wildly unimaginable, just taller than me, and I'm 6 foot. Mary froze. The wild man-looking thing was swaying from its left side to its right side. Mary pointed and managed to call out my name again, and this thing answered her with a ooh, ooh, that sounded like hoo, hoo. At that, we were both completely startled. I sat both detectors down on the ground and yelled, "Don't move, Mary," thinking it would go away. But it stood there swaying from side to side. There were parts of its body that had hair growing on it, and he was unshaven. I will tell you, it was quite a sight. His head seemed smaller than it should be for the size, and his hair was lengthy and tucked behind his large ears. Mary called out, "Bigfoot," and it finally registered in my head. I went back and picked up the MDs again, turned them off, and started to move rapidly toward my wife to protect her. The why and how hadn't occurred to me yet. When I got to Mary's side, I could see the wild man's frightened eyes. The face was like any ordinary man's unshaven face, but the rest of him was larger around than most men his size. He saw my metal detectors and kept looking down at them, like shifting his eyes from us to the metal detectors and then back up. He took one step backwards into the shaded area where he was less visible. His hair was thick, long, black, and looked well groomed. It was long tresses, and one side was pulled back, tucked behind his ear. It was straight, but the beard he had was curly. His face was young, I would say, and his features distinct. I'm sure the metal detectors looked like weapons, because he looked quite apprehensive. Then, this wild man turned, took one giant step toward the trees, and was gone. I'm sorry to say we never saw him again, but at the time he departed, I was most relieved. We moved on down the road, not wanting to be out after dark. We reached the RV, got inside, and locked the door. We were both shaken by what happened. Mary wrote down the details on her notebook, and I sat across the table as she wrote, still trying to come to terms with what I had seen. Did I say he wore no clothing? What an unexpected thing to come across with a metal detector. We were finally able to laugh after dinner, but I thought we should leave that area. We haven't been back, but we heard that local stories of Bigfoot are widespread in that forest. This was all we could think of to tell in the story. We are now with the Metal Detecting Club, scouring the shores in Fort Walton Beach, Florida. Mary has been very lucky finding jewelry, rings mostly, and coins. What a fantastic account. I think everyone should have an encounter like this. Even though it's surprising, it's probably not going to keep you from the woods. This next account comes to us from a scoutmaster in Tennessee who had quite an experience on one of their outings in the Smokey Mountains. Hope you enjoy. In the summer of 2017, I was leading a scout group on a camp out in the Smokey Mountains near Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. The group of 10 boys, all aged 11 and 12, myself and 2 other scoutmasters, planned this trip for over a month. We were to hike a well-known trail to a certain mountain peak, camp for 2 days, then hike down to our canoes that had been dropped at a muster point, then canoe out to our vehicles 7 miles downstream of Cold Creek. The hike went well. We reached our predetermined camping spot and began to unpack and get set before dark. As some were setting up tents, I took my son Jake and 2 other boys to gather firewood. It had been a glorious day, and only about an hour of sunlight remained. As we gathered sticks and small logs to burn, my son said, "Who's up there, Dad?" pointing just up the hill. I turned to look, but saw no one, though I did hear some rustling about 30 yards up the hill. "What did you see, son?" I asked. "I just saw someone, just head and shoulders, standing up the hill for a second, and then they backed up into the bush." Knowing the others were behind us to the west, if that was one of our group, they would have to have been quite fast and nimble to make it up there in the time we'd been gathering. "It must be some animal, Jake," I said. Then we gathered what we had and took it back to camp. When we got there, we could see that everyone was still there and thought nothing more of the apparent animal up the hill. Camp was set up and the fire was lit just as the sun was dipping below the mountains. Myself and Scoutmaster David were preparing supper. The boys were sitting around laughing and cutting up. I was just getting the cattle on the rack when we heard it. It was the strangest howl-like scream coming from across the gorge to the north. The laughter quickly turned to silent stares as this blood-curdling howl rallied off the mountainside. "Sounds like a wolf, maybe," Harold said, the other scoutmaster. The 3 of us knowing all too well that was much too powerful and high-pitched. That was no wolf. David and I leered at one another for a moment, then dropped our gaze and half-heartedly agreed. "Yes, it's probably a wolf," I replied, not wanting to worry the scouts. "He's nothing to worry about," I said. "There's far too many of us for him to bother with." Nevertheless, we could tell the scouts were uneasy, as a cold silence purloined any supper-time conversation. We finished eating, cleaned up, and prepped our packs for an early morning hike. Then we all settled into our tents for the night. Just as I was dozing off, a calm quiet blanketed the hillside. Not a single cricket or frog could be heard. This is not uncommon when a predator is in the area. All it takes is one noisy cricket to stop chirping abruptly for the rest to follow suit. Now I was wide awake. I slipped on my boots and went out to sit for a while with my dull machete in hand. It was little more than an oversized letter opener. I stoked up the fire. If an animal were to come near, I had a cup full of lighter fluid to dump on the flames and light up the area in an instant. The crickets slowly began to chirp again, and after an hour or so, I prepared to re-enter my tent. Suddenly, I heard a twig snap along with some rustling about 20 feet to our east. I alerted toward the noise, dull machete in one hand, lighter fluid in the other. Harold poked his head out of his tent. "What are you doing, Will?" he said. I held my finger to my lips, the universal signal to be quiet. I heard the rustling again, this time closer, about 15 feet, just behind Harold's tent. Harold was still poking his head out of his tent. I could see by the size of his eyes he was waiting for me to make a move. If it hadn't been for that strange howl earlier, I don't think such a small noise would have us so much on edge, but it did. I decided it was time to shed some light on the subject. I took the cup of lighter fluid and tossed it on the fire. The whole area lit up like midday. The flame shot up to about 6 feet, and I could see what looked like a large figure take off toward the east. All I saw was black and what looked like arms flailing about, but what I really noticed is that it had a heavy foot and was running off on 2 legs. It appeared to be about 5 or 6 feet tall and moved extremely fast with hard thumping steps. Harold shot out of the tent, stumbling over his own feet. David and a few of the boys came out to see what was going on. I told them there was a large animal around and I was just scaring it off. I didn't tell them exactly what I had seen, but I stayed up most of the night in case it came back. I'm not sure what that was standing there that night. The rest of the trip went as planned. The boys earned badges and learned skills. I kept an eye out for anything strange, and once I thought we were being followed, but never saw anything again. What I know is that the strange howl we heard that night was like nothing I'd ever heard, and the dark figure that was upright definitely ran off on 2 legs. That was from Will James from Gatlinburg, Tennessee. Thanks, Will. If you'd like me to tell your story here on Storytime, you can email me at bigfootodyssey@gmail.com. And if you like those 2 stories, give them a thumbs up and a share, please. And once again, thank you all so much for listening.